Well, I think there's two different ways to think crisis in the field of, well, urban security and all its connection. One is a present of crisis. And well, in this regard, I mean, like it's a few decades at least that the discourse about cities and security is deeply marked by this idea of a permanent crisis, of permanent threats, especially, as we know, since the terrorist attacks of 2001, 2004, 2005. In the West, but not just in the West, we've been living with this idea of the constant presence of threats, be it terrorism, but also other types of security risk, constantly being there. And then, of course, there's a lot to be unpacked on this idea of crisis. To begin with, the very fact that it is not true that cities are becoming more insecure in time, but actually during the last few decades, at least in the Western world, but generally all around the world, cities have been becoming more secure. But then there's another way to think about crisis, which is maybe more relevant to our present and to our future, which is thinking about future crisis, upcoming crisis. And there, if we think about a number of trends, about the growing global inequality and how it may foster a return of new forms of violence, if we think about climate change and how, for instance, forced migrations may push security crisis at the borders of nations, but even in cities, and the number of other looming crises that we've been discussing lately, there the crisis becomes something that will look toward the future. And so we think about the future of this crisis. You know, if we look at the future as, you know, as a projection of the present, you know, what will be, you know, the work of forecasting, there I would say that, well, the future is pretty gloomy, right? I mean, like if we think what has been happening in the last few years in terms of decades, in terms of increasing of inequalities, of increasing presence of certain type of politics that really stress the issue of security, about migration especially, etc. The growth of ultra-rights, Donald Trump, Salvini, Theresa May, even worse than Theresa May, Orban. I mean, the future seems pretty dark in this respect. And so the trends that we've seen the last few decades in Western cities, which is an increasing securitization of cities, you know, the use of a hard means of repression, of prevention, made of policing, made of bollards and bunkers and barriers and CCTV. These seem to suggest that the future will be more and more characterized by looming and theoretical or real security crises and a strong polarization of populations that are in conflict and try to protect each other. But then when I look about the future, I prefer to think in a different way. And I'm pretty much inspired by Neil Smith's last lecture, which was titled, well, the last sentence of the lecture says, well, the future is radically open. And so this idea that the future needs not be the projection of the present, that there are conjunctures, that there are bifurcations, there are moments that allow for changing, for pushing in other dimensions, in other directions. And there, the idea of crisis comes again, because the crisis in, well, since the Greek origin of the term, means a moment that calls for a decision. A crisis is a moment in which things can go different ways. So there is need to decide what to do. And so in this sense, what means like an open, radically open future for urban security and more generally for all the things linked with urban security? And what there is like the progressive idea of, well, we know there are many ideas that we have on how making societies and cities more secure without securitization and violent means. And we know that healthier cities are safer, that more just cities are safer, that more equal cities are safer. So the answer would be we need to improve a number of fields, welfare policies, urban policies, urban regeneration, making cities more vibrant, that would increase safety and at the same time diffuse the rhetoric about crime, about violence, about terrorism. But I think this is probably not enough in the present conjuncture, because exactly because the trends toward different type of policies and politics are too strong and too powerful nowadays. So probably what we need is new ideas, new ways to think, hopeful ways, utopian ways to think security. And well, this is like a project that is more complex, you know, that rebuilding the welfare, but I believe is kind of necessary in an age in which pragmatic change seems not to be enough, exactly because of the powerful and incredible, profound challenges that we're facing. And there in the field of security, there are many ideas that may help us think in that direction. One is Judith Butler's idea of vulnerability, of accepting that a certain degree of risk, of threat is normal, is inevitable, so that we cannot strive for absolute security, but what we think is rather thinking how we can share security better. Well, so thinking of security more as a collective endeavor than an individual one. The point is maybe not protecting each one of us, because we cannot protect everybody, but understanding how we can share in a more fair and just space and just way security. And well, and I will close saying that I believe that this endeavor means rethinking more generally our socioeconomic system, and that probably the point is really overcoming what we call capitalism, which has been showing us that it is precisely incapable of thinking in the long term the security threats that are on our face, climate change above all, and try and think a new way to navigate the future that is more just, more equitable, and more focused on a shared idea of security.